Ever wonder how Rome really turns a crowd into a weapon against one woman in seconds? Polybius describes fustuarium, deserters clubbed to death by their own unit, and that logic slips into slave yards because blame disappears. So what other devices let Rome control women through fear, shame, and paperwork-free violence? Today, I reveal 20 of them. Let's see why. Let's start with number 20. Lacuous strangling rope. In Italy at Rome's peak, maybe 20 to 30% of people live in slavery, so owners need fast ways to erase trouble. That is where the lacuous comes in, a simple strangling rope looped like a tool, yet used like a sentence. Ready for the quiet part of punishment? Latin writers use lacuous to mean noose, and some describe prisoners in the Tullianum prison choking in darkness, far from any crowd. Why keep it hidden? Secrecy protects officials and saves money, because no games, no cross, and no medical check are required. One pull ends it, and bodies vanish. For an enslaved woman, the rope fixes an owner's headache without paperwork. She can be dumped outside the city or pushed into a mass grave. No inscription follows, no tomb waits, and no name gets written down. What scares people is how ordinary the loop looks when it bites hard. And here is the twist. A silent death can feel almost merciful beside what comes after. Romans also strap people to benches and chairs during questioning, beating them until they speak. Once a body is fixed in place, every other tool works better. Here comes number 19. Sella poenai torture chair. Romans take seating seriously. Curule chairs for magistrates and thrones for emperors, so a punishment chair feels like a dark joke. The sella poenai turns sitting into control. You sit, straps lock, and you realize the goal is endurance, not comfort. What happens when you cannot move? Pain stays personal. Legal and rhetorical texts describe slaves tied to benches or frames during questioning, beaten until they tell the truth. That rule matters, because courts treat slave testimony as valid under torture. For women without citizenship, that becomes legal permission, and guards can repeat questions until answers fit their wanted story. Picture a heavy wooden chair in a prison room. Arms bound to the sides, ankles strapped, chest pinned to the back. She cannot stand or fall, so whipping or burning is easy. If she faints, water wakes her. The chair becomes daily management, and every watcher learns to stay quiet. Owners use that scene to punish hiding money, refusing a master, or helping another slave run. Once the ropes come off, skin still feels the wood. Then a whip appears with bone or lead tied into its cords, called flagra. Can you hear it crack right above your back tonight? Let's move to number 18. Lead-tipped scourge lashes. Ancient sources describe Roman flagra with bone or lead tied into the cords, and that detail changes everything. A leather whip alone hurts, yet metal and hard bits tear. You hear the snap first, then see the glint. Why build a whip that shreds instead of sting? Blood shows fast. This punishment targets people outside full citizenship, especially slaves and provincials, which often includes women with no legal shield. The effect can push victims toward shock, even before other penalties. Do you notice the status math? Citizens expect limits, while non-citizens face discretion, and that discretion becomes permission to escalate without a clear stop. In slave households, the scourge covers late work, disrespect, unwanted pregnancy, or rumors of escape. There is no fixed legal limit for lashes on slaves, so the officer can keep going. 2 lictors can strike in turns until boredom wins. That makes it cheap control, and it teaches witnesses as much as the victim. A post in a courtyard turns pain into policy. Other slaves watch, memorize, and obey, because the cost of speaking up feels too high. After skin is torn and muscles ache, Rome can shift to a killing method that looks collective. Polybius describes soldiers clubbing a man to death. Ready for the cudgels coming down together? Next one is number 17. Fustuarium execution cudgel. Polybius describes fustuarium as soldiers clubbing a deserter to death, done by the unit itself, and that detail hits hard. No blade, no formal stage, just cudgels and orders. Why make the group do it? Shared violence locks in obedience, and fear spreads through the ranks in one lesson. Outside the army, masters hold wide freedom over enslaved people, especially away from the city. A beating ordered by an owner can end in death, and accountability can be weak. Do you see the risk? When punishment stays private, cruelty can rise because witnesses have little power, and victims have even less, creating easy impunity for the powerful. For women, fustuarium-style killing feels like a mob. A runaway or a servant accused of poisoning can be thrown down in a yard. Household men, and even other slaves, may be forced to strike until movement stops. The message lands everywhere. Refusal brings punishment, silence buys survival, and fear becomes group discipline. The method is blunt and repetitive, and that is the point. It destroys the body and the idea of protection at the same time. Once blunt force feels normal, torturers can switch to something that only hangs and stretches. Roman punishment descriptions include suspension from posts or frames. What happens when the beam starts to turn while you hang? If you want more hidden history like this, hit subscribe and like right now. It helps this series reach more people. Let's move to number 16. Rotating suspension beam. Roman punishment accounts describe suspension, bodies hung from posts or frames with arms stretched overhead, and the pain can last for hours. Reliefs also show hooks and rings fixed in walls and ceilings, built for hoisting captives. Why build hardware into a prison? Because display and control work better when the setup is always ready. Now add a rotating crossbar on a pivot. Wrists are tied, feet barely touch, and the beam turns. With each shove, weight shifts from one shoulder to the other, and the body cannot find balance. Hands go numb, nerves burn, and panic rises because turning follows every attempt to twist away, creating no safe angle at all. This works as a warning scene. Put the victim where other slaves must pass, then talk about theft, adultery, or rebellion while she turns. The crowd learns to self-police, because the cost of standing out feels too high. Owners accept the trade-off, because even if shoulders are damaged, the fear effect can be huge, making obedience the goal. When shoulders weaken and arms tremble, torturers can aim at humiliation as well as pain. Roman torture uses boards, beams, and screws to pin bodies in place, and later European presses echo that logic. A chest-focused press hits power and shame at once. Want to see how pressure turns into a weapon with one twist? Here comes number 15. Breast-focused wooden press. Roman torture uses boards, beams, and screws to pin bodies in place, and that simple design makes pressure easy to control. Tighten a little, ask a question, tighten again. Why does that matter? Because step-by-step pain keeps hope alive, then crushes it, which makes compliance more likely in the moment. In a slave system, women's bodies serve as labor tools and sexual property, so a chest-focused press adds humiliation to control. Status drives everything here. Citizens expect protections, while enslaved women face a master's discretion. The device also spreads blame, since a guard can point at wood and claim the harm happened, hiding human choice behind mechanics. The basic logic matches later European presses: two solid surfaces, one body, and wedges or a screw that tighten without mercy. Breathing turns shallow under pressure, and movement grinds flesh against wood. Do you notice the trade-off for an owner? Pain forces obedience now, yet injury can reduce work capacity later, creating profit risk if the worker survives. Once pressure devices feel acceptable, gravity becomes the next shortcut. Stones cost little, stacking takes minutes, and weight keeps working with no guard swinging anything. Archaeology from mines and prisons shows rings and platforms that can anchor restraint. Ready for punishment, built from plain stone blocks that sit everywhere? Let's move to number 14. Stone weight pressing frame. Archaeology in Roman mines and prisons shows rings fixed in floors and walls, plus low platforms that can anchor restraints, and that hardware enables weight punishment. Put a board over a person, then stack stones on top. Why choose stone? Because masonry sits everywhere in Roman life, so the method stays cheap and available. One block feels like punishment, yet 5 or 10 become a slow crush. The setup can target chest, stomach, or limbs, and the person beneath has little control. Do you see how power works here? Slaves carry the stones, slaves stack the stones, and sometimes slaves watch someone go quiet under them, learning what happens when an overseer decides the limit, creating workplace terror. A foreman can stop early to cause lasting injury, or keep adding until breathing fails. That flexibility turns weight into a tool for intimidation as much as killing. It also fits a system with weak oversight on estates and work sites. When punishment needs no judge and no special tool, abuse can become routine, and the trade-off is moral collapse plus damaged labor. After stone comes heat. Fire is already common in workshops and kitchens, so heating metal takes minutes. Roman sources describe slaves branded for running away, and collars carry capture instructions. A wide bronze plate can brand more than a point. Want to see how a single press becomes a permanent label? Next one is number 13. Heated bronze punishment plate. Roman sources describe slaves branded for running away, and sometimes tattooing appears on the face or forehead, which shows how normal marking can become enslaved control. Why mark a person? Because a mark keeps working after the beating ends. It tells strangers who owns her, and it changes how they treat her, creating lasting identity. A heated bronze plate expands that logic. Instead of a small iron point, it can cover a wider patch in one press. Scholars have studied slave collars from Italy and North Africa with lines like, "I have fled, hold me and return me," and "cheating whore, seize her." Imagine that message paired with a matching scar, and you get a portable stigma that follows everywhere. For enslaved women forced into sex work, visible branding also shapes economics. Clients, guards, and passers-by read the damage before any talk. Owners may accept the trade-off, since intimidation and easier recapture can matter more than resale value. The controversy is built in. Marking invites more abuse, because labeled people are easier to dehumanize, creating social fallout that spreads beyond the victim. Once marks exist, pain can follow into movement. Roman soldiers wear hobnailed sandals for grip, and archaeologists find thousands of studs on forts and battlefields. Flip that design inward, and walking becomes punishment. Want to feel how control can start inside a shoe? Let's move to number 12. Nail-studded punishment sandals. Archaeologists have found thousands of Roman hobnails across forts and battlefields, proving how common studded sandals are in military life. That matters because common materials make cruel inventions easy. Drive spikes or cut nails inward, strap the sandal tight, and walking turns into injury. Why target feet? Because feet control pace, and pace controls escape, creating movement control. Enslaved women often travel long distances to estates, mines, or coastal work sites, so forced marching can become its own penalty. With sabotaged footwear, every step drives metal into flesh. What happens if she slows? Guards can beat her, and peers may pressure her to keep pace, because group punishment is always possible. One person's pain can discipline many, creating group pressure on the road. Roman law treats slaves as property, which shapes cost thinking. A master can weigh injured feet against the benefit of fear and compliance. That trade-off may look rational inside the system, yet it creates long-term losses, lower output, higher care needs, and higher risk of mistakes that trigger more punishment. Abuse becomes self-feeding, and the result is routine violence for everyone trapped in it. When feet fail, restraints shift upward. Wooden stocks with semicircular cutouts can lock ankles, wrists, or necks, and moving the design to thighs forces posture and exposure. The clamp becomes a stage. Want to see how humiliation starts with 2 beams? Here comes number 11. Thigh-squeezing wooden clamps. Stocks and clamps appear across punishment history because wood is cheap, easy to shape, and hard to break. You cut semicircles, hinge boards, and lock them with pegs. Move that design from ankles to thighs or knees, and posture becomes controlled. Why does posture matter? Because posture controls dignity, and dignity controls behavior, creating public leverage. Set the clamp in a courtyard or near a workshop entrance, and the punishment becomes a display. People pass, stare, and learn what a line looks like. Accusations like theft or disobedience can trigger it, and the victim cannot shift easily. Even without extra blows, time becomes punishment, because holding one position strains muscles and drains strength. That slow grind creates time pressure that feels endless. The long-term consequences can last years. Restricted blood flow, nerve pain, and joint problems can reduce mobility and work capacity. Do you see the trap? Injury lowers output. Then, lower output can trigger more punishment, and the cycle keeps spinning. Overseers who value fear over productivity may accept the economic loss because intimidation protects authority, creating short-term thinking that hurts everyone. Once legs weaken, the environment can become a weapon. Roman arenas use pits for staged executions, and rare religious punishments include sealing people into chambers. Heat, sand, and exposure can do what clamps start. Ready for punishment that uses the ground itself against you? Let's move to number 10. Burning sand burial pit. Roman arenas use pits as traps and stages, and executions like damnatio ad bestias can play out in front of crowds, which shows how architecture supports punishment. Rome also practices live burial in rare religious contexts, sealing condemned vestals into an underground chamber as a bloodless death under religious rules. Why does that matter? It shows slow death can be framed as proper when status and ritual align, creating twisted logic. Now picture a pit under open sky with hot sand. Heat reflects off stone seating, dehydration builds, and grains grind into skin and wounds. Crowds can shout, throw objects, and treat the scene as entertainment. Do you see the power move? The state turns punishment into public messaging, and the audience helps enforce it by normalizing cruelty. Approval reduces risk for officials, and fear spreads faster afterward through stories, creating crowd permission. For enslaved women condemned as rebels, poisoners, or repeat runaways, the penalty often includes disappearance. No grave marker, no recognized identity, and no public memory beyond the spectacle. In Roman culture, inscriptions and burial signal status, so erasure becomes a final blow. It also removes evidence, protecting perpetrators and keeping the system smooth, creating hidden loss that is hard to trace. After the pits, the display can continue above ground. Ancient writers describe criminals left in cages or hanging chains as warnings, and cheap versions can use wicker. A basket can keep a body visible for days. Want to see a punishment that turns a person into street furniture? Here comes number 9. Hanging wicker punishment baskets. Ancient writers describe criminals displayed in cages or left hanging in chains as public warnings, and Rome uses similar displays along roads and near gates. That practice matters because visibility is the goal. A wicker or wooden basket can act like a cheaper cage and cheap display scales. Why pay for metal when woven walls still deliver fear, creating public memory that sticks? A basket barely large enough to curl in turns exposure into punishment. Sun bakes during the day, cold bites at night, and the victim depends on captors for water and food. Do you see the psychological lever? Dependence breaks resistance because every need becomes a negotiation. Guards can also lower the basket to beat or question, then lift it back out of reach, turning height into control, creating on-off power that keeps panic alive. Slave collars show how owners use text to control people. Scholars have studied collars from Italy and North Africa with lines like, "I have fled, hold me, and return me." And one from Bulla Regia calls its wearer a cheating whore and orders others to seize her. A hanging basket becomes a living sign, adding social shaming to physical suffering. When display ends, transport begins, and guards often drag prisoners through corridors fast. Roman sources tie hair to status, modesty, and punishment. Hair becomes a handle. Want to see how a tool can turn beauty into leverage? Let's move to number 8, hair-dragging hook rod. Roman sources describe hair pulling and hair cutting as punishment and shaming, tied to status, modesty, and sexuality, which makes hair a control point. In slave markets and brothels, owners treat hair like display and restraint. Why hair? Because it is easy to grab and painful to pull. Add iron and force multiplies, creating safe cruelty from a distance. A hooked rod can catch braids or loose hair and yank hard enough to drag someone across stone floors or down steps. That matters in crowded spaces like prison corridors and arena tunnels, because movement becomes punishment before interrogation even starts. The victim struggles to protect the face, and reaching for the tool can make the pull worse, which traps her in a lose-lose choice, creating instant helplessness. Public dragging sends a message to everyone watching. A woman pulled like cargo tells other slaves that dignity has no legal shield for them. It also speeds the process for officials. Faster movement means fewer chances for intervention, fewer moments for sympathy, and fewer witnesses willing to speak. That efficiency makes cruelty easier to repeat, creating rapid control that feels unstoppable. Once the body reaches the interrogation room, speech becomes the battleground. Roman jurists accept slave testimony only under torture, so controlling a mouth fits the system. A jaw-prying gag turns questions into pain. Want to feel what happens when the hinge of the jaw becomes a pressure point? Next one is number 7, jaw-prying iron gag. Roman jurists accept a harsh rule. Slave testimony counts in court only when extracted under torture, and that policy drives interrogation methods. Why build a system like that? It assumes fear forces truth, even though fear can force whatever answer ends pain. That tension sits at the center of Roman practice for slaves, creating truth risk built into the process. A jaw-prying gag can work as a metal bar between the teeth with straps around the head. Tighten it, and the victim cannot spit it out. Add a screw that widens the opening, and pressure hits teeth and jaw joints. Speaking becomes hard, swallowing becomes harder, and breathing feels strained, which keeps panic close. That is speech control with mechanical force. For women, silencing carries another consequence. A woman trying to report abuse by a master has few safe channels, and elite status can shape whose story matters. A tool that controls speech reinforces that imbalance because it limits protest in the moment and signals that complaint brings punishment. The method fits a wider pattern. Power sets the narrative, and low-status people pay the price, creating status locks that feel permanent. After mouth control, torturers often return to limbs. Limbs determine work capacity and mobility, so injury can shape a life for years. Roman sources mention stretching devices like the equilius, pulling arms and legs in opposite directions. Want to hear the sound ropes make when they tighten one click more? Let's move to number 6. Limb-stretching windlass frame. Roman sources mention the equilius as a stretching frame used for interrogation, pulling arms and legs in opposite directions. The key detail is control. Ropes tighten in small increments, and each turn can raise pain without a new blow. Why use stretching? It forces helplessness with a steady dial, and that dial keeps hope alive long enough to break it, creating incremental terror. Slaves and other low-status suspects face these frames when officials want names or hidden goods. The system rewards results, so torturers push until they get words that sound usable. For enslaved women, joint injury carries extra risk. Dislocated hips or shoulders can reduce field work ability and complicate childbirth, so the torture can shape the rest of life even if she survives, creating lasting damage beyond the session. The sound matters too. Wood creaks, ropes groan, joints pop, and nearby prisoners can hear it, which spreads fear through a whole building. That social effect is efficient. One person's suffering intimidates many, and it discourages solidarity, because helping someone can feel like stepping onto the frame yourself. Fear becomes governance, creating a fear network that keeps groups quiet. After stretching, some methods target breathing, because panic rises fast when air feels limited. Roman punishments include suffocation ideas, like the poena culei and sealed chambers for condemned vestals. In interrogation, a hood can do the job. What happens when ash fills the space between lungs and air in real time? Here comes number 5. Ash-filled suffocation hood. Roman punishments include suffocation ideas. The poena culei sews a parricide into a leather sack with animals and throws it into water, and condemned vestals can face sealed underground chambers with limited air. Those examples show Rome understands breath control as punishment. Why does that matter for interrogation? Breath triggers panic quickly, and panic can crush resistance fast, creating fast surrender. An ash-filled hood adds another layer. A hood blocks vision and orientation. Pour fine ash from a hearth into the hood, and each inhale irritates the nose and throat, pushing coughing and distress. The method can leave fewer visible marks than whipping, yet it can still cause intense fear. Guards can also remove the hood for relief, then put it back on, creating on-off control that keeps the mind trapped. Breath threats also reshape memory. After a few rounds, even cloth near the face can trigger anticipatory fear, which can make future compliance easier. The supplies are common. Ash and cloth exist everywhere, so the cruelty travels easily. That portability matters in estates, workshops, and prisons. Criticism is structural. When ordinary materials become tools of domination, cruelty becomes normalized, creating cheap abuse that spreads quickly. After breath control, interrogators may shift to smaller tools that target high-sensitivity spots. Precision pain can force answers without big equipment. Roman writing about torture includes piercing among methods, and later descriptions mention needles and hooks aimed at nails and feet. Want to see how small tools can feel bigger than a rack? Next one is number 4. Barbed interrogation needles. Roman legal practice ties slave testimony to torture, and piercing appears among the methods described, which makes needles a practical threat. A small point can cause strong pain with little setup. Why do interrogators like small tools? They travel easily, they look minor to outsiders, and they can target places that matter for daily work, creating portable pressure. For enslaved women, targeted pain can focus on hands trained for spinning and weaving, or feet needed for carrying and market trips. Injure a hand and you threaten productivity, which raises dependence on an owner for food and shelter. In sex work settings tied to slavery, control over mobility and resistance can increase a pimp's daily income, so punishment can follow money, creating a profit motive that turns pain into routine. Interrogation also runs on uncertainty. Every question becomes a gamble. Answer and risk betraying someone. Refuse and risk another puncture. That moral stress can break solidarity fast. It also poisons evidence, because people under pressure often say what they think the interrogator wants. Even Roman courts face this problem. Torture can produce a confession, yet reliability stays doubtful, creating truth risk that never goes away. After piercing, permanent marks become the next step. A beating fades, yet a mark follows a person everywhere. Ancient evidence for branding and tattooing of slaves is strong, and collars carry capture instructions. A comb-like branding tool can spread scars in rows. Ready to see how a body becomes a warning sign? Let's move to number 3, branding comb for flesh. Ancient evidence for branding and tattooing of slaves is strong. Sources mention fugitive slaves marked on the forehead, criminals labeled, and collars with capture instructions. One collar from Bulla Regia calls its wearer a cheating whore and orders others to seize her because she fled. Why mix insults and instruction? Because it controls behavior through shame and capture at once, creating textual punishment. A comb-style branding idea builds on the same logic. Instead of a single point, multiple raised teeth can place a row of marks at once. The key effect is permanence. A temporary beating fades, yet a scar reshapes how strangers react. It can reduce the chance of help during escape and increase the chance of capture, because people can identify the problem quickly, creating a portable stigma that follows everywhere. For women forced into prostitution or hard labor, visible marks can function like forced advertising. They signal ownership, prior punishment, or alleged immorality, and that can invite more abuse, because bystanders feel permission to mistreat someone already labeled. Owners may accept trade-offs, since intimidation can matter more than resale value, creating status downgrades that lock in vulnerability. Once a body is treated as public property, public humiliation scales up. Roman amphitheaters can hold tens of thousands, and executions mix punishment with spectacle. Height and motion keep crowds focused, so a turning display can spread shame across every seat. Want to see what happens when a crowd gets a rotating view? Next one is number 2, spinning humiliation pole. Roman amphitheaters can hold tens of thousands, and executions often mix punishment with spectacle, including crucifixions, animal killings, and staged myth scenes. Why stage violence at scale? Because crowds amplify political messaging. Fear spreads faster when many people watch and repeat the story afterward. Display platforms and poles help, since height improves visibility and keeps attention locked, creating mass theater. A spinning pole concept turns a bound person into a moving exhibit. Rotation lets different sections of the crowd see bruises, burns, or exposure, and that shifting view keeps the spectacle fresh for longer. The psychological goal is shame plus disorientation. For enslaved women, whose bodies are already treated as property in brothels and estates, forced display confirms that personal boundaries carry no legal weight, creating public humiliation that feels total. Crowd behavior also changes accountability. When thousands jeer, few intervene, and officials read silence as approval. That approval lowers the risk of consequences for cruelty, and it blurs the line between justice and entertainment. There is also an information problem. Spectacle focuses on impact, not due process, and leaders can satisfy the crowd to maintain authority, creating mob incentive that pushes harsher scenes. After the crowd leaves, wounds remain, and control continues in quieter ways. Everyday supplies can be turned into tools. Romans used salt and vinegar in food and drink, and soldiers drink pasca, which shows how common those liquids are. Put them on open cuts, and pain stays active. Want to feel how control can hide inside a bandage? And the last is number 1. Salt and vinegar wound cloth. Salt and sour wine or vinegar are common in Roman life. Soldiers drink pasca, a mix of water and vinegar, and kitchens preserve fish and meat in brine. That everyday availability matters, Because torturers can use the same supplies with no special equipment. Why choose them? Because they interact with damaged tissue and can intensify discomfort during care, creating cheap extension of punishment. Cloths soaked in brine and sour wine can be pressed into cuts left by scourges, needles, or burns. The purpose goes beyond immediate pain. It can keep a person sore and cautious for days, slowing movement and reducing resistance without constant supervision. The method creates a cruel trade-off, keeps the victim alive enough to work, yet keeps pain present enough to remind her of power, creating forced recovery that feels endless. This approach fits daily routines. A whip or rack requires an event, yet salty cloths can be reapplied during normal work cycles, which makes control continuous. For enslaved women pushed back into labor or sex work, lingering pain changes every task. Lifting, walking, and enduring unwanted contact become reminders that disobedience has costs, creating routine violence that follows everywhere. The part that grips people is how ordinary the tools look. Rope, wood, ash, salt, all common items, yet law and status turn them into weapons. When cruelty blends into daily life, people stop seeing it as shocking and start seeing it as normal, which is the real trap. So here is the hook to leave you with. If common objects can do this, what else in Roman control hides in plain sight right under our eyes? We opened Rome's darkest doors, but one last corridor stays locked. Your next story goes deeper, with proof and names. Click the next video on your screen right now, please.